Hey guys, in this video I'm going to talk about my top 20 reasons why EverQuest is my #1 game of all time. I've played a lot of games throughout the years and no game has quite affected me and stayed with me the way that EverQuest has. And I've been thinking about making this video for a long time. And I've looked through YouTube and I haven't really seen a lot of videos really documenting this kind of stuff. So I thought I'd put my own video together, come up with a list of things that I thought made EverQuest really special and one of a kind. And even to this day, I haven't really seen any game or MMORPG that compares to the experience that EverQuest brought to the table. And in fact, I think there's some things about EverQuest and the time when it came out that I think it's actually kind of impossible for any game to do some of the things that it did at the time, because it was released in 1999. So there's some things about the internet culture at that time that were special and different compared to now in 2018. So I'm just going to go through my list and do my best to capture and summarize the way I feel about EverQuest. So we'll start at number 1, at a hostile game environment. And some may say, well, that's a bad thing. Well, if you look at the popularity of a game like Dark Souls, that game was extremely popular because of how difficult and dangerous the game was. And thereby that game design made it more satisfying and when you actually succeeded. So the lows were lower and the highs were higher. And when you accomplished something, it was more meaningful because you knew that the game was difficult. So it meant a lot more. And here are a few examples of how hostile the game was. Number 1 was the trains. Now, if you've ever played an MMO, you know about trains. You've heard of trains. But I don't think there was any game that had trains the way EverQuest had trains. So the way aggro worked in that game. Now, you've probably, and just up front, I'm going to let you know, you've probably played World of Warcraft, okay? So I'm going to use that as a frame of reference for a lot. And I love World of Warcraft, especially vanilla. The first few expansions were cool, and I played those as well. But for me, it was a very polished, well-produced. It had a very high production quality, but it never compared to the experience that EverQuest was. And perhaps it was just because it was my first, but in my opinion, it was more than that. It was beyond that in my mind. So in World of Warcraft, for example, when you aggroed a mob, it returned to base. And like you could just run away. And after a while, it would just return to base and say, oh, well, I'm too far from my spawn point. I'm just going to give up on you and go away. Well, that didn't happen in EverQuest. EverQuest had this concept of discrete zoning. Okay, so you would zone from one zone. You would go from, for example, Lesser Feydark into Castle Mistmore. Okay, and it would like load. It would have to load up that zone in order to do that. So when you were in a zone, say Castle Mistmore, and you were way deep in Castle Mistmore, you would, and say you got in trouble, your party's like, oh no, like we've got all these ads and we don't know what to do. Well, you would just have to run to the zone line and hope that everyone made it. Usually you didn't. And so you would have to shout out, hey, train to zone. And of course, it would cause complete chaos, bedlam, and excitement if you kind of thrive on chaos. I mean, there's an exciting element to the train. Like, oh boy, how big is this train going to be kind of thing. And hopefully you could just lay low and not get the attention of any of the mobs. So the trains were really dangerous and perhaps even arguably bad game design. But I loved the trains in that game. Blackburrow, Castle Mistmore, Lower Guck, even Kazakh to an extent. Those zones had, I specifically remember trains in Blackburrow. It must have been almost every knoll in the entire zone, like standing at the top of the ramp. it was crazy. And thankfully I was on the other side of the hole, so they didn't aggro on me. But it was pretty an amazing sight to see all of those mobs come, and they would chase you all the way to the zone line, and that's the only way you could lose aggro in that game. So that was a form of a hostile part of the environment. Is you either had to win or run or die. Those were your options. You couldn't just run away and then it would just leave you alone. There was none of that. So that was, in my opinion, part of what made the game cool. I liked the trains, and I thought it added an element of excitement and intrigue to the game. Now, kill stealing, especially in the early days, kill stealing was another harsh part of the game. In the early days, all that mattered was, did you do the most damage? You or your group. So whoever did the most damage, they got the XP and the item. So kill stealing was super common in those days, especially like a wizard or something like that. They would just come along and just blow something up in like a couple of seconds, and they would steal the item from you, and they'd be like, "Oh, how could you do that?" And yeah, I get it. I understand the Care Bear argument of, "Oh, how could you allow that in the game? That's so uncaring, and that's, really not fair." And later on, I do believe they changed it to whoever engaged first or something like that. In any case, I kind of liked that in a way. It was just part of the game's general principle. Hey, whatever happens, and it's up to the players to decide on how to be diplomatic about it or not. And that was like one of the key concepts about EverQuest that made it cool, was it let the players decide a lot of things that these days the server or the people in charge are deciding, right? So it's leaving more things up to the players to sort it out and figure it out. So another aspect of the hostile game environment is probably the only game I've seen do this, is you couldn't see at night. Like if you were a human or any race that couldn't see at night, you could not see at night. Like it was really hard to see, and you needed like some kind of lantern or some kind of light bearing item in order to see. Like it was really bad. In fact, my first character was a barbarian, and I was just running around in that tunnel in Velious, and I'm like, it's 1999. I'm running around. I haven't even figured out how to do full screen mode yet. So I got that partial camera mode that was in classic EverQuest, and I couldn't even get through the hallway. And I'm like, dude, I cannot even find the zone line in this tunnel because it was that dark. Okay, you just needed an item of some kind. And, some may say, oh, that's bad game design. Oh, you're not helping the player. Where's the neon sign pointing to what they need to do? But that was just the part of the concept of EverQuest. It let the chips fall where they may. And humans were notorious, especially monks, because you could only play a human in those days. They would be, like, dying just because they couldn't see things. I mean, and so they had to be really careful at night. That was the point. There was just one more thing they had to watch out for, especially if they died. Because when you died in that game, you lost your items, and it was stuck physically on your corpse. So you would have to go and recover your corpse with no light source at all. So it was really difficult in that regard. And that was part of the whole, another aspect of the hostile game environment was the merciless death system. And at times it was almost like too hard, in my opinion. And I'll explain why. So the death system, I liked that you lost XP. I didn't. I thought that was fair. Another aspect that I don't think any game has done since that I'm aware of is your corpse would drop and stay on the ground physically. Like you would say, Melfin's corpse is on the ground. And then you would have to run back to wherever you died, which could have been a horrible part of the zone, and actually get your corpse. Now you could drag the corpse and like run over there, have a friend. You could consent corpse and have someone drag it to the zone line, which was a whole other issue that created so much mischief Anyway, I'll get into that later. So you would have to recover that corpse, and that was a major challenge. It was like, oh no, he died in this horrible part of the zone. We're gonna have to go back and get some help. You might have to like get help from another group in order to get back there. Anyway, so that part was, the death system was pretty rough, man. And you could even de-level, which I actually disagree with. I don't think they should have allowed de-leveling, personally. I thought that was a little bit too much. I think once you get a level, you should keep that level. Not to mention it causes a lot of bugs and coding issues. Like, it has to do so many checks. I know I'm a game developer myself, and I just know that's going to create issues like, oh, now you got spells on your bar that you shouldn't even have, and it's got to check all these things and make sure. Inevitably, bugs crop up with that sort of thing. Anyway, so it's just a buzzkill, big time. Like, I think that's too much. That's one thing I would not put in a game if they came out with it in, like, 2019, came out another one, or they put it in Pantheon, the new game they're actually developing now. So, another aspect is you could actually, like, I knew this guy that was in Upper Guck, and he bound himself at that zone line right to Lower Guck. Big mistake, because he fell asleep, and he de-leveled from, like, 35 or 40 down to like level 5 or 6. Dude, I don't know. He lost like a crazy number of levels and de-leveled all the way down. So those are just the kind of stories that you only hear in EverQuest. It's like, whoa, you can actually do that? Because casters could actually bind themselves anywhere, like even like a horrible spot, like a zone line in a hostile dungeon. But, that was his decision, and that's what he did. So, that's part of the whole merciless death system. Another thing that, was there one more thing I thought they shouldn't change? Yeah, maybe not. Anyway, so the corpse runs, of course, the persistent corpses. Actually, you could actually make you could make art out of your dead corpses and like spell things, and because they would be there for a long time, like weeks. Like, I think they lasted, depending on the level, what the level was and how many items are on there. Maybe it was just the level of the player. And they would be there for a long time. Like, in fact, when I left the game, I put my corpse in a very specific spot so everyone knows this guy left the game. He's got all his items, and he's done playing. Because he's done spending like 18 hours a day playing EverQuest. Because it was crazy addictive. Like, I didn't even know games could be that addictive. It was crazy. That's a whole other story. Anyway, so another thing, the result of that hostile game environment was that people had to be more diplomatic. And that was the first game I ever saw like that. And even World of Warcraft wasn't really like that. If you were a jerk in that game, your reputation would get around and people would know who you were, and it could have real serious consequences. For example, I had a friend that was known for consent looting corpses. Like, you could consent to have your corpse dragged, and then you could loot their items. It was crazy. Anyway, that was questionable design. That's a whole other issue. But he was known for doing that, like, on multiple occasions, so he was known as a scoundrel, and his reputation got around, and he couldn't get into certain guilds because of it. So it's like, it blew my mind that that could even happen in the game, because it was like, what? I've never heard of that before. And even since, I don't feel like a lot of games you didn't really know people's reputations, or you might know about the guild maybe, like, oh, they're a good guild, they're a bad guild. But getting down to the level where you knew things about individuals, and they were good players or bad players, that was the only game that I really saw like that. Like, I felt like the hostility of that environment in EverQuest was the only game where you could be legendary because of it. Because due to how difficult it was, you could do things that were amazing, and you could really help people out, and they would remember that forever because they'd be so grateful. Or you could do things that were really awful, and people would remember that because, oh man, we were trying to do something and he did something horrible to us. He trained our whole group and ruined it. I will never forgive that guy. And it's like, it was a game that where you just really created memories much more easily. And to this day, I haven't really seen many games like that. And I think maybe that's the biggest reason why. Let me move on to number 2. Or we have like 10 minutes in. I'm finally getting to number 2. I'm going to try to go faster, I promise. That was a big one. The hostile game environment's a big one. Because I feel like that's a really key part of what made EverQuest special. And in some aspects, I do agree it was a little bit too much. So number 2, I would say, is the difficult travel. And you could even perhaps link that to point 1. It was very, very difficult to get around in the world. Perfect example is running from Kinos to Freeport was an adventure, okay? And if you could pull it off, it was like you just climbed Mount Everest or something like that. Pretty much. In fact, because there's so many horror stories, there's a horror story, I have a horror story. Which means that a lot of players have horror stories. I tried to run from Kinos to EverQuest. What happened? I get to West Commonlands, and guess who kills me? Dragoon's Idol. Dragoon's Idol saw me from like 5,000 miles away, and he's like, "You, Ranger, you will die." So he like runs across, and he comes and kills me, and I'm like, you gotta be kidding me. I just ran for like an hour, over an hour, and got killed. Because what happened was I had Spirit of the Wolf. It's a spell that makes you run faster, and it didn't matter because he cast a spell on me that did Engulfing Darkness, canceled out Spirit of the Wolf, and I'm running slower, and then he just annihilated me. So I was doomed. That was horrible, a bad thing that happened to me, but I remember it to this day. That's how I was scarred. I have PTSD from EverQuest. That it was just a horrible thing that happened, but made it great when I finally did arrive there. I was thankful. And so yeah, the world just felt bigger because you had to run. There wasn't like a taxi service or like a bird that I could just ride over there. Now there were porting services. That was a thing. But most people, especially in the early days, didn't really have access to that kind of thing, and it usually cost you some money anyway because people had to take time to cast a spell on you. Later on it was more accessible, but especially in those early days it just wasn't possible. And the only way you could really get around was ports and the boat. Okay, and the boat is a whole other story. The boat was like, I think it was actually like a 12-minute boat ride. That you would have to go to the dock and wait for the boat to show up. I think it must have easily taken 20 minutes just waiting, getting on the boat, waiting for it to leave, and then you would have to drive through the ocean of tears, and you could watch the islands go by, and you could jump off the boat at any time. It wasn't like World of Warcraft where you go on rails like on a bird and fly around. It wasn't like that at all. You could jump off the boat, and in fact there are all kinds of bugs where you could like lag out and not appear on the boat properly, and then you would just like appear like swimming in the ocean, which was really bad. That never happened to me, but it did happen to people. Anyway, so then yeah, you would go through the whole zone and then arrive in Butcher Block Mountains, and then you get off, and then you would finally be able to go to Unrest or Mistmore or wherever. It was a hell of a boat ride, and it was actually, you know, it's like, it was a memorable experience though. I don't know, it's just like this concept of rushing through everything. Like, people are just like constantly trying to automate everything, automate their entire experience because it's more efficient, it's faster, but you lose something as a result of doing that. It's like people are too focused on the destination and they're not enjoying the journey. It's the problem with, like, for example, in World of Warcraft, you could automate your group formation. cross server, random people. I hated it. It's like it was like grouping with robots. It's like you didn't even know who they were. No one chatted. No one said anything. You just went through the motions. Hopefully it was a group that knew what they were doing. It was not fun at all. It's like there was nothing memorable about it. It just wasn't the kind of it wasn't a memorable experience the way that EverQuest was. And here's another thing. We'll move on to number 3, which is the fact that this is not something EverQuest specifically did, but it was something about the era that it came out. It came out in an era before everything was documented on the internet, okay? Wikipedia did not exist, and all of the similar websites that are based off MediaWiki software, those things didn't exist, okay? There were ragtag websites thrown together that may have documented things somewhat, but it's not like the web is today where everything's documented before the game even comes out. I mean, you know how it is. It's like you can Google almost anything about any game and find it somewhere. You know, someone's got the information on YouTube. You know, YouTube didn't exist. Video content was not really a thing. In those days, it was very difficult to find any good videos about anything. So that was great for the game though, like, because everything was so mysterious. You didn't know how to do quests. And you know, I think Alakazam was one website that did exist, and you could get some info, and hopefully there was a comment that was helpful, maybe with a location or some kind of info or what to say to access the quest. There might be some info out there, but generally speaking, it was a very mysterious world. Like, you didn't know what was out there, you didn't know how it worked. The quests, you actually had to, like, it wasn't like modern quests where you click an exclamation point. It was like you would hail them. You would start a conversation with an NPC and be like, you would have to read the words and look for like square brackets and be like, oh, that's a key phrase. I'll say, and then you have to type that, and then they would respond, and you would have to like read and then respond with whatever was in quotes. So it actually required you to type it out. And that's how you interacted with NPCs and got through quests. So there was a lot more attention to detail. The player had to really engage their mind a little bit and try to figure out what NPCs wanted. And sometimes you weren't sure. There was just a lot of mysteries about how to activate certain quests, how to discover quests. The whole quest, it was called EverQuest, but to be honest, there was not as many quests as there are in modern games. It's like expected. Like I'm gonna be doing a quest all the time. My quest log's gonna be like completely full, and I'm just gonna have this giant list of things to do. But EverQuest was not like that at all. Quests were like actually an occasional thing that you did, that you would sometimes discover, but really the main bulk of the XP you were getting was just from grinding it out with a group inside of a dungeon, or maybe soloing out in some open zone somewhere. I would say almost all the XP that I got was with a group in a zone, like in a camp where you would pull mobs to it and kill them. That was how I got most of my XP. So that was not something EverQuest necessarily did, but it was something about the era that EverQuest came out in. Like, even if that game was released today, it would not be the same because of how things were in 1999. Number 4, legendary EverQuest drama, okay? And this kind of rolls downhill from the whole fact that everything else that I've mentioned, like the hostile game environment and how difficult everything was. Okay, it kind of upped the odds. It increased the ante on everything. It made everything much more... the stakes were just higher in general because you knew how difficult it was to accomplish things. And people would, the good and the evil would come out in people. There was a very famous incident on our server, and I'm sure there were so many incidents just like this, where people would they call it power looting, where they would just loot something. And it's like, people would be like, whoa, dude, you just looted the item. Because anyone in the group could loot it, whoever killed it, right? So they would just take the item, and there was like nothing anyone could do about it. And so you had to be careful who you brought into the zone, who you welcomed into your area. And there was this one guy who, what was his name? Spinals. I remember his name to this day. He was a troll Shadow Knight. I think he's a Shadow Knight who power looted something in the Plane of Fear. It was like a high level zone. And they claimed to roll for it. So they're like, okay, roll for this item. And they both did a random, it's like a random 0 to 100. And they both rolled. And then he lost the roll, and then he rolled again. So he rolled a second time, and he won the second time, and then he looted it. And then he said, he was like a Korean guy. Like he was actually, but there were a lot of actually Koreans that played this game. And he would say, he was famous. He said, me no reroll. Me no reroll. And it was like a meme. You know, it was like everyone knew this guy's me no reroll. And I don't remember whatever came out of that, if they ever resolved it or whatever, but I just I will remember me no reroll as I go to the grave. I'll never forget that. That's a good example of drama. There was another guy in one of my groups. He power looted a crested helmet in Castle Mistmore, and everyone was just like, just watched him loot it, and we're like, yo, what are you doing? And he just disappeared. He just left. I'm like, hey, you just power looted that. Can you, like, we're rolling on it now. I'm interested in that item. And he's like, nope. So it didn't have the magic rolling thing that like WoW had, where you just click, oh, I'm interested in this item. I click roll. And it wasn't all fully automated. Like you had to roll and then like be civilized people and then distribute it and be honest about it. And of course you got like a bunch of teenagers and preteens playing this game. It was just like so much drama. It's crazy, dude. I never power looted, man. I have some dignity, you know? Don't let them take your dignity. What were some other examples? There was a guy, I was dueling in the best of the best. You know who you are. Fey Lagoon, Sylvan Master. He clicks his J-boots in the best of the best. And I'm like, clickies are not allowed. You're not allowed to click any item in a fight. So I just stopped fighting. And it was like a pretty even fight. And I was like, I just stopped. And sure enough, the GM disqualified him. And that caused like a ton of drama. Because this guy's like a guild leader. So now he's like, you know, got to deal with all of the fallout of that. But yet, you know, again, it's just another thing I remember to this day. And I'll always remember it. I had a friend who was in Befallen. And he fell down. There's this hole in Befallen. I'm not even personally familiar with it because I didn't go to Befallen a lot. But there was apparently this hole you could fall in, and it was like really hard to get out because it would be like a locked area and you needed someone to come and let you out. So if you couldn't get someone to come and let you out, like, I know this sounds like horrible game design, but you know, it is what it is. Like, I don't know how this happened to him. But he fell down this hole and he was stuck there. I think he died. Now, for whatever reason, he just decided, screw it, I'm just going to restart my character. He could have just, if it was really that bad, he could have just left his items there and been like, whatever, I'm low level, I'll just, you know, deal with it and come and I'll just get some new items. I'm a monk anyway, you know, I got fists, so it'll work. But for whatever reason, he's like, whatever, I'm going to re-roll a necromancer. That's what he did. And then I had, here's another example of drama in EverQuest, was I had a friend who was a corpse looter, okay? He would he would trick them into giving them consent to their corpse, and then he would loot all their stuff and then hide their body. And that's horrible. But he did it multiple times to many people. And he got crazy amounts of stuff. And he, in fact, he did it somehow to the same person twice, which is amazing to me. There was this person named Mistak, M-I-S-T-A-T-K, and I don't know what was with this person, or like if they were just not the smartest, or I don't know what their problem was, but How are you going to let the same person consent loot you twice? And took all the stuff. And then he took her corpse and put it in Mistmore Lake. And like, I don't know, just for fun. And like to this day, we're like blown away that she allowed it twice. Like, what in the world, dude? What are you doing? But it's just one of those things. And this guy, you know, he caught a lot of fallout from that. He was not allowed into like I wanted him in my guild, but they wouldn't let him in. And I think that I kind of don't blame him, because he didn't really know that your reputation actually got around in EverQuest. So, you know, he was probably playing just like every other gamer. He thought, well, I can just do whatever and just screw people over. And then he realized, oh, wait, you actually have like a reputation? People remember you? You can actually, you know, your reputation actually matters in this game. So it was kind of a thing that we had to figure out as we went along. But there's so many. There was this massive gold duping drama on Fen and Row when I played there. And like a whole bunch of them got banned. There were people that were like hacking accounts. There was a guy named Nigmo, a wizard that would kill steal like raid loot. He would sneak in somehow invisible. He would be invisible, sneak in, and he would watch them as they get ready to go in and take on, for example, Nagafen, right? Like the famous red fire dragon in EverQuest. And he would go in and he would sneak up on him and be like, boom, 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 and he would get the kill. And I know he pulled this off at least one time, and he would loot the whole thing and just gate out of there. Like, later, suckers. Now, I don't know how many times this happened, but I know he did it once. I don't know if he got in trouble. I don't know what happened. But I do know that it's happened at least one time that I know of. And I know that, I'm sure whatever I've heard of, it's happened many other times as well. Fancy the Bard. If you Google Fancy the Bard, I think everyone knows who that dude is. Not to mention Fires of Heavens, another guild, where they have an entire message board just full of legendary moments. Completely saving people from the I knew people that like they would go into the plane of fear and like their whole raid would wipe and they couldn't get all their stuff back because they would be screwed, and they would have to like get other guilds to bail them out, and they would have to go in and like, dude, you'd be like a hero. You could be a legend in that world. You know, you could be like, this so and so came in, he kicked butt, wiped everything out. He had a perfect plan. He executed. He had everyone, you know, he led us to victory and got everyone's stuff back, you know. And people remember stuff like that when you bail them out. Like, I almost lost all my stuff in Plane of Fear because we just couldn't get in there one night. It was really hard to do. And nobody really had like the strategy down. It required a very specific strategy. And I almost lost all my stuff in there, but you know, I was very thankful when someone bailed us out and helped us get our stuff back. It's just another example of how things went in EverQuest. It was very different. Number 5, another thing that I loved was the lore enforcement culture of the game. Like, there was an out of character chat channel where you would say your things that were not in character, and then there was shout, where you'd say things that were like, hey, I want the whole zone to hear it. And then say was assumed to be like in character conversation as well. So the game's chat channels were designed to, you know, enforce the fact that when you're talking, you're in character. So they didn't completely enforce like, oh, you have to be role-playing at all times or we're going to come and like ban your character. But, you know, they did want you to have names that were consistent with the lore of the universe. Like, almost everyone that I saw had a name that was very fantasy-esque or fantasy-inspired. And then you had to submit to get a last name. Like, when you hit level 20, you did surname whatever, and then the GM would, like, anoint you. Like, you are now Melfin Sinefe from now on. So, like, I've never seen a game do that since. That was another thing that was very unique about EverQuest. And, you know, some people might take issue with that and be like, oh, you know, I don't need the man breathing down my back telling me what to do. If I want to be fart master, sniffer, bobbin, or whatever, you know, that's what I want to be. But I remember one time I was goofing around and I made a troll with a doofy name, and I was kind of curious. I was like, were they going to do anything about it? I don't know. And sure enough, GM shows up, locks me in place so I can't move, and says, hey, listen up, buddy. You know, names like that aren't going to work. You're going to have to change your name. Log out right now. And, and sure enough, you know, he made me change my name. And that was that. But you know what? I agree. I think with a game like that, I think they should have some role in cultivating the culture of the game. I do think that stuff matters, especially in an RPG. It kind of comes with the territory. And I'm okay with that. I think it's a good thing. Number 6, the player-run economy. The economy in that game was not completely directed by game mechanics like auction houses, and, you know, you couldn't just go click on something and travel instantly somewhere. The travel... So players had port spells, they had gate spells, they had you could bind your bind point, which is where you respawn. There were a lot of services that people would pay for to other players. So it's like, hey, I need Spirit of the Wolf was like the most common one because it made you run faster. So people would ask for spells from each other and pay for the service. Porting was a big one, of course, because you wanted to go to, you know, West Karana or whatever. And that was a big thing. And I don't know that I've seen a lot of that outside of like trade skills. I have seen it, you know, but then you do the trade skill and then you go on the auction house and put it there. So that kind of, and you know, auction houses are very convenient, but it definitely has an effect of it destroys any kind of trading culture that the game has. Because it's fully automated, now there's no such thing as the East Common Lands tunnels. There's no auction culture within Kelethin was a big one. People would often do trading at Kelethin, and then you would have to go and meet them somewhere and actually see what they look like, and then you would, you know, see all their equipment, and you would learn a little bit about them. And you know, the guy that I bought my first rings from, he was an enchanter, and I had to buy my rings from him. I had to go and look at him. I'll see who this guy is. I would learn who he was. So you would actually know who you were buying from. You would know, that's how another way that you would develop the culture of the game. You would learn about people and who they were and what they were selling. And you could, you know, the same goes for the people that you got ports from and everything else. You learned about those people, and you would that's how you got to know people in the game. So auction houses are great. They're very convenient, very, you know, it makes a lot of sense in some ways, but in other ways it does undermine the culture of the game. And it just becomes, you know, the more and more you automate, the more you take away from people engaging with each other and actually communicating. Number 7, I don't know what to title this, but the charm spell shenanigans in this game were so memorable. Okay, here's an example. Probably one of the most memorable things that ever happened to me in a game. Well, it actually didn't happen to me, but I saw it. I just observed it. There was some joker running around, probably a bard, in Kelethin. And this is when the game was still very new to me. It must have been like July or August 1999. And someone in Kelethin was like the Wood Elf City. I was walking along and I saw the Priest of Discord. Now the Priest of Discord was like this level 53 plus NPC super mega uber mob, and basically he was designed to not be killed. He's just a guy where that you can turn in a book, and then your player converts into a PvP character. That's a whole other story. Anyway, so somehow someone charmed the Kelethin guards, and then they attacked the Priest of Discord. I think that's what happened. because I didn't watch the whole thing happen. I just saw the aftermath. So I walk up and I see like the entire Kelithan militia fighting with the Priest of Discord, and I'm like, holy cow. I mean, you had to think back then, there was nothing like that in games at that time, like like NPCs fighting and battling it out with each other. It like blew my mind. There was like all crazy spell effects, like everyone was like, all of the NPCs were getting like crazy spells cast on them. And you know, I'm like level 12 at the time. I'm like, what is going on here? This is crazy. They're like, this guy's fighting all of the guards, and at the time I had no idea what was going on. I'm like, what is going on? There's just like flashes of spells going all over the place, because the spell effects were like huge in that game if you had them all turned them up, if you turn them up all the way. And I think the Priest of Discord actually won that fight, if I remember right. I can't remember, but it was crazy because basically I think the bard or the enchanter must have charmed and then attacked him, and then I don't know if he just ran away or what. I don't know what that guy ended up doing, but maybe he ran away and came back. I don't know what happened, but it was pretty funny to see that. And there were a lot of other similar things like that, right? Like and I don't remember charm really being a big thing in World of Warcraft. I think it was a little bit, but it wasn't like a bigger thing. Like in EverQuest, I just remember so many stories about charm and the funny results of charm. Like I remember Minthy Divisi, okay, this mob, she was like a gypsy in Castle Mistmore. I remember a few trains I remember a few trains where she would charm somebody, and then she would, in that giant train, she would have like some random like ranger or a warrior running around with her, helping her kill all of his buddies. And you know, I'd be like I would be back on the wall, like trying not to get killed, like trying to stay out of it. And you know, and then eventually everyone zones out, and you'd see Minthy Divisi go walking back to her spawn point with the warrior still with him. So like you would see her you would see him marching back with her. I'm like, that poor bastard, he's gonna get annihilated when charm breaks. And sure enough, the charm breaks like way down the canyon, and he's just completely destroyed and dies on the ground. I mean, the poor guy, he must have been like laughing, but also like feeling like horrible because he just lost a bunch of XP. But it was really funny. There was a lot of good stuff like that. Charm in that game was just really a fun and interesting mechanic, but also useful. I used it to like level up from like with my enchanter. I would charm dwarves and then, you know, they have them attack each other. It was really and I'm not saying other games didn't have charm, but the way that charm was designed in that game was really useful and actually was used quite a lot. So that's just something that I remember that I thought was really cool about that game. Number 8, I want to talk about the meaningful faction impacts in EverQuest. Here's a good example. If you remember the Ruins of Kunark expansion, there was a place called Temple of Vishan, and okay, I farmed Castle Mistmore a lot, and the faction hits in there made you actually friendly with the dragons in Temple of Vishan. So I remember one specific time, because me and my friend, we're big time Castle Mistmore farmers. We're both rangers, we're both level 50, well 60 at that time, and we loved farming that place, even in the Kunark expansion. We would get hooded black cloaks, we would get all that stuff. And so there was this one incident where there was a big train in Temple of Vishan, and I didn't act. It was like something went really wrong early in the fight, so I never hit him, and like everyone got wiped out in the whole raid, and except me and my buddy Demetrium. We're both standing there, and we're like, that's too bad. Like everyone got killed, and we're just standing here, and the dragon's like just walk right back. Like they don't care about us at all. They're like, hey, your friends, you know, those guys are causing trouble. That's too bad. Too bad for them. And we're just sitting there and we're like, wow, they just got wiped out, but we're just still here. That was an interesting example of faction, and it was very... There was just a lot of impacts of faction, and the race you picked, the class you picked, what deity even that you picked could have a big impact on how you were treated by NPCs in that game. And it often had pretty serious impacts, and probably the most compared to any RPG that I can ever think of. Because simply picking, say, example, a necromancer, just playing that class, it made it almost... I mean, it made a difficult game even more difficult, because almost everything was trying to kill you all the time. Like, most of the NPCs would be hostile to you, like even in major cities, and you had to be really careful about it. Rogues as well often had this problem, and certain religions and stuff like that. So playing a good class, race, whatever combo, you had it a little bit easier. And evil, you know, there was definitely more of a good versus evil divide. The culture felt more divided in that regard compared to any other game. Even in World of Warcraft, where you had a very hard, you know, the game was designed on purpose to be like Horde and Alliance, like, and there was that split between the two. It was designed that way, and you were just like I think you were naturally PvP, or you couldn't group with each other. I forget exactly how it worked, but that game, you could group with anyone in EverQuest, but like they had a hell of a time going to your cities and everything. Like I couldn't go to Neriak because it was the Dark Elf city. There was no way I could go there. And there was like kind of like Freeport was kind of a neutral city where everyone was kind of went. But even still, like certain combinations still had issues depending on what area they were in. So I feel like the way that was designed, I haven't really seen. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like even World of Warcraft didn't do it the same way they did it. It was a lot more. I feel like a lot more thought went into those games. It's hard to describe, but it was just different than World of Warcraft. Even like the Necromancer, like certain classes, it wasn't just the race, it was also the class. So it was more complex than how World of Warcraft broke it down. Anyway, so that's what I thought about that. And then the GM interactions, I think, were a lot... number 9, this is number 9, the GM interactions in that game were a lot more interesting. For example, GMs would often... You know, we all know that like games like WoW would do GM events or whatever once in a while, but I have heard so many more GM-related stories in EverQuest compared to any other game. And I don't know what it was about the GM / it had a guides culture. There were also guides who were like not paid people or something like that. And like there were so many more stories related to guides or GMs and how they helped people, or them playing tricks on the players, or like I remember a specific event where I was in Lesser Feydark and I saw some random message like something about a unicorn or something like that. And I ran around that zone for like 15 minutes trying to figure out what the heck that meant. And I was like, what was that? And I think it was like just some GMs like screwing around, like messing with the players. And I think there was a guy named GM Tunzo. I feel like he was kind of like a famous GM on Fen and Row. I remember so many like random stories about that guy. And I just don't remember anything like that in other games at all. Like, but I do remember a case where like a GM had to help me find my corpse one time. They would actually try to help you out in some cases. So they knew the game was difficult, and so they had this GM culture there that would help people in cases where like They felt like all hope was lost. So there was like sort of like a lifeline system almost. And of course they would also be there to discipline players, and when they got in trouble, or when they're trying to name themselves crazy things, they would be there. I remember a particular story where one of my friends he got in trouble for some reason, I don't remember what, and the GM would warp him. They had all these commands, like where they could warp you to them, or they could lock you in place. So they had like this, things, like, I don't know, a bunch of commands they could run that were like their superpowers, right? So, and I know they could lock you in place and then make you stop talking. They could do all this stuff. But there was a funny story where the GM did it to my friend, but they didn't take into consideration that he had an item where he could click. He clicked his breastplate and he teleported. So, he's like, the GM's trying to talk to him and he's like teleporting out of there. I was like, I always thought that was a funny story. So, there was just a lot of more interesting GM interaction culture, which made it kind of interesting for the players, because like, oh, the gods came, they're almost like the gods. They came down and they would, once in a while, they would help us, or they would, strike us down if we were sinning in Norath or whatever. So it was just an interesting part of the game that I haven't really seen other games do. I don't know why it was like that, and I'm sure others have way more stories about it than I do, because I've heard through other people more than I've had interactions myself. Number 10. Another thing I loved about EverQuest was the Uber mobs. The Uber mobs were high-level mobs that would randomly march around in lower-level zones. Or they could even be considered like mobs that were way above the area, the expected strength of mobs in a specific area. A classic example of an Uber mob would be the hill giants in West Corona, for example, or the specters that were in Oasis. Or another one I would consider an Uber mob is even something like Lockjaw. Lockjaw was much higher level than all of the other mobs in Oasis. And he was just like a high level crocodile, and he would run around and murder like all of the level 15 players that were running around. But really, more so, it was more like the hill giants, because the hill giants were not just, they were mobs, but they were also gigantic. Like, they really blew you away. Like, when you were playing and you were looking up at these things you could see them from far away. Like, you'd see them marching around, and you'd be like, whoa, that guy is huge. And, like, the thought of fighting that mob was just, like, unthinkable. It was like, whoa, there's no way. I'm not going anywhere near that thing, because, of course, that all played off of how dangerous the game was and how much death really affected you in that game. And I remember there was a mob called Elizosaur or something like that in the Ocean of Tears. I never even fought that guy. I just saw him from the boat and I'm like, whoa, I'm not going over there. That guy's gonna destroy me. He's like a level 49 or something like that. He was like a giant lizard. That's all it was. It looked like a dinosaur, but it was basically a giant lizard. What were some other Uber mobs? I mean, you could consider maybe Divin. Ambassador Divin was he was like a mini Uber mob. He was much stronger than other mobs in Crushbone. He was like, but he would backstab for like double 44, or I think double. Did he have double attack? And that was a lot of damage in that game, especially if you were like level 15 or 16. I mean, he would just like rip up a whole zone sometimes, and you would just see a trail of corpses all the way to the zone line. And it made that game dynamic, exciting. It instilled fear and gave you respect for the environment. And you knew that death was always just around the corner if you got a little too cocky. So I like the whole Uber mob thing. I feel like that's something that was kind of missing in WoW. I mean, there would be mobs. The mobs are almost always formulaically in line with whatever the zone level was, and it was very rare to see something like that in World of Warcraft. I don't really, maybe there were. I just don't remember them. Like, maybe it wasn't the same as the way EverQuest was. Number 11, the inspired item design in EverQuest. For example, in World of Warcraft, your items are like color-coded, yellow, green, or purple, you know, whatever. But they never really felt that interesting or special or memorable. So it just felt like, oh, this is the level X item that you're supposed to get. And the PvP armor was like a perfect example of that, because it was so focused on having perfect balance, but it resulted in having very uninspired, boring items. Because it really is like, it got to a point where it was just like, why don't you just remove the items, and then we'll know it's perfectly balanced. Okay, so it's like, it got to a point where like it didn't even matter what items you really had. You just got a little bit of an advantage because you got the slightly better item, because you've been doing this for two months. This other guy's been doing it for 3 months, so he's got slightly better items that he's earned from his points or whatever. So, I mean, the items in EverQuest, if I had to sit here and write down every item that I could remember from EverQuest versus every item I could remember from World of Warcraft, I could probably sit here and list dozens and dozens of items from EverQuest, which I played much longer ago. And World of Warcraft, I don't know, man. I could maybe a handful off the top of my head. Like, can you think of any? Like, if you played World of Warcraft, can you name any? I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can think of some. But for me, I really struggled to name any. Like, the items were just not memorable the way EverQuest were. I can sit here, I can name Rubicite Breastplate. I can name Flowing Black Silk Sash. I can name Deceiver's Mask, okay? I can name Short Sword of the Akesha. I can name Electrum Bladed Wakizashi. Crested Helm. You know, I can name all these items. Cloak of Flames, Afridi Boots, Earthcaller, Ivy. You know, there's so many items that I can just list and list off the top of my head. And in many cases, I can even name the stats, like Electrum Bladed Wakizashi. I know it's 7 damage, 21 delay. Short Sword of the Akesha, 8 damage, 24 delay, has a Akesha proc on it. Rubicite Breastplate had 19 armor and a regeneration effect. That's just stuff I'll never forget because the items were so memorable. Journeyman Boots, classic items. Okay, Dwarven Work Boots, 8 armor, and I don't know if I remember this, but I think it's, I'm going to say 3 strength, 5 dex, perhaps? It's just like an example of, there's no way in the world I could remember that amount of detail from a game 20 years ago for anything else. But those items were so, they were all designed, they weren't designed for specifically for someone. It was more like Diablo 2 item design. It was just like, hey, I'm going to design an item, and then whoever finds it useful, they can use it. Now there were race and class restrictions and all that, but you know, the game really left it up to the player to decide what items were good for them. They didn't even color code them. Okay, you had to kind of look at the item and do your own analysis. You know, the game wants you to do the work and figure out, is this a good item for me or not? And I mean, eventually you got good at it. You'd be like, okay, I like strength and stamina for my character. I'm going to look for items that have high numbers of that. And, you know, eventually you started to, you know, for a long time, people didn't know how useful agility was. Or dex. Like, is dex that useful or is it not? If you're, like, is it good for casters or is it good for melee or both? Or, you know, for a long time there was a debate about that. And for a long time we rezzed one of my friends who was a rogue who always wore platinum black pearl rings, and they were like, you know, they had agility and dex on them, and we're like, man, that doesn't do anything. And because most would go with like strength or stamina for a rogue, and we would kind of razz him about that, like, dude, are you ever gonna get rid of those rings? They're not good for you. And he was like, no, I like them. I'm just gonna keep wearing them. So we're just like, whatever, dude, just wear whatever you want. But that was the point, is that the game didn't make all these decisions for you. You know, you had to do your own homework, you had to do your own trial and error, you had to figure it out yourself. Do your own tests, you know what I mean? And that was the cool thing about that, is that it didn't make all those decisions for you. It didn't say, here's your level 58 armor, here you go, good job. You got your, you know, armor. They might as well just call it armor underscore level underscore 58. Here you go, that's what you wear at this level. It's just a very mechanical, robotic design. It's just not inspired. It's so safe in terms of item design. It's so concerned about item balance. You know, sometimes the game can be a little imbalanced. Sometimes let the players get an edge. Let them get a little bit of an imbalanced, an advantage via, you know, their home. You know, they did their homework and they got a little advantage from something. All right, well, that's cool. That's part of the fun of, you know, experimenting with different items. And that was a cool thing about that game. Number 12, we're going to move on to first-person cameras. And the first-person camera was special in EverQuest. I don't know what it was, but I've never played another game where I could look at people and know what items they were wearing. They were like, WoW was really disappointing in that regard. I thought like every 3D game was going to be like that. But nope, I would play other games and I'd be like, I don't know what this dude's wearing. It just looks like, WoW just looked like cartoony. Like, the items all look the same except for maybe the weapons. And like, you know, you'd have kind of noticed the hat maybe, but I never recognized a hat on somebody, I don't think, that I can remember. But I definitely remember for example, the crested helm model on the half-elf. Like, you knew, when you saw that RoboCop helmet, you knew, that's probably a crested helm. You would inspect them and be like, yeah, sure enough, crested helm. Like, there were any plate helm could have that look, but you knew that was a popular item that people would wear at whatever level, and you could pretty much figure out what item he was wearing just by looking. And certainly weapons, I definitely recognize weapons. You would see, you know, that's a bone-bladed claymore. Oh, that's a giant Zweihander. Oh, I can look at that and tell that's polished granite tomahawk or whatever. Yeah, I haven't really seen other games that are like that. Even the chest plate, like Rubicite breastplate is legendary for this. Like, you could look at that red breastplate and you knew that item was perhaps the most legendary item in all of EverQuest. Just because the fact that it also got removed from the game. That and the Deceiver's Mask. You know, you could turn into a dark elf. It had a dark elf illusion, which was really cool that people liked. Because it actually had a faction adjustment, too, when you changed into a dark elf. Sometimes that was useful, because you could sneak into Neriak and stuff like that. So that was a really cool part of that game as well. I just feel like other games have not done the first-person camera angle as well. It was more immersive. My number 13 reason is that mobs buffed each other. And this was a really cool... I don't remember this really happening in WoW, because in WoW, the game was designed, they really moved towards the whole instance thing. So the way dungeons worked in WoW is you ran through a dungeon. They didn't do the whole camp spot thing, right? So in EverQuest, it was really predicated on camping, and you would sit in a certain spot, and then your polar would... So there was something really special about that in EverQuest. Kind of an interesting dynamic part about that is that if the polar was good, he could get mobs before they buff themselves. And I was a ranger, so I was always trying to pull mobs, and I was trying to pull them before they even were able to buff themselves or do anything like that. So, and that sometimes that was really important because they buff themselves pretty considerably. They would put, you know, an armor buffing spell, they would buff their hit points, they would put damage shields on themselves. So it really made a big difference if you could, you know, either pull with a dispel or something like that, or you could cancel their magic basically, or you could pull them before they could even think about doing that. And sometimes it took a long time to cast those spells, so you could do things like start attacking them while they're casting some long spell, or maybe just or if you're a paladin, you could actually interrupt them or cast a stun on them or something like that. So I just liked how NPCs played by a lot of the same rules that player characters did. Like, you know, they actually had to buff up, or it was a big difference if they didn't buff. So I thought that was a cool part of the design of the game. Number 14, let's talk about the fluff utility spells. The utility spells in this game were really well done. And I'm sure there's a whole laundry list of some, you know, skills and spells that I'm not thinking of. As a ranger, some of the cool ones were tracking, which were tracking was an amazingly interesting skill in that game. You could make a whole video about how tracking worked in that game, how it sorted the list, how it, you know, how you would find rare mobs, all that kind of stuff. Other ones that come to mind are bind sight. You could target a mob and put your sight on them, and that was really cool in a zone that was super dangerous. And say, for example, a great example would be Castle Mistmore. You'd watch one of those trains go back, you would target a mob, and you would hit them with bind sight, and then you would see what they see. Which was amazing, because they would walk into like Castle Mistmore, and which was like a super scary place for most of, even at level 50 it was scary. And you would see them go in there, and it's like this crazy gothic castle, and there's like all these mysterious bends and turns and hallways. And it was just, you felt like you were almost like, that was real. I mean, that was just such a cool concept in those days, especially in a very new 3D game. The fact that you could do that was so interesting and innovative. I felt that really was an innovative thing. I don't know if a game did that before that. Another one was Harmony and Illusion. The way aggro worked in that game was really well done. For example, Harmony was a spell that a ranger could cast, but only outdoors. And I feel like people didn't really catch on to how Harmony worked for a long time. I feel like the only dude that knew how that worked. You would cast it, and then that would shrink their aggro radius like almost down to nothing. And you could like just walk through like an entire courtyard full of mobs, and you know, people would think you were some kind of pulling wizard, and you could be kind of a legend because you could single pull mobs, which was a big deal. Because if you pulled 3 mobs instead of one, you're like, whoa, this is a much harder fight. You had a much harder time. So I had a lot, you know, I made things a lot easier for my party when I was able to pull one thing at a time instead of multiple. And so using Harmony was a big part of that, and that's a spell that I love to use. Another utility spell that comes to mind is there were like illusion spells that enchanters had, and I think they actually like implied faction hits, and all kinds of weird game mechanics were wrapped up with casting illusion. You could disguise yourself as like an end table, just like you would look like a carpet or something like that. It would just randomly disguise himself as something that was nearby. It was just like there were so many like interesting things that had little to nothing to do with how the actual battles went, or the gameplay went. You know, nothing that was like designed for a boss fight or anything. But they were just cool spells that you could do that would be useful in, you know, limited cases, or maybe not at all, or just interesting. And it was really cool to see that level of detail and thought go into the game, because they could have just, you know, did a minimum viable product and just gave you, here's the 10 spells that you need, or the 8 spells, and that's all you need, you know, just go with these spells. But they went the extra distance. They put all kinds of interesting spells, fun spells, things that didn't necessarily make the game, you know, weren't required to be in the game for sure, but they were cool. And it made it feel like a more fleshed out magic universe and all of that. Let's move on to the number 15, which is the number of mysteries that are in this game. I think this was part of the mystique of EverQuest, is how many mysteries were in this game. In fact, there's a channel on YouTube called Michael's Shenanigans. I'd recommend looking him up if you're into EverQuest. And he's got an entire video about the mysteries in EverQuest, and I'm sure he didn't even cover it all, because there's just so many mysteries in EverQuest that you couldn't cover it all. You could probably, write a book of all the things in EverQuest that were just mysterious. No one knew how it worked. No one knew how the quest worked, if it was even working. People couldn't even figure out if alchemy was broken or not for like a long time when the game came out. And people were like, oh, it's broken, and I guess Varant thought it wasn't broken. I don't know. But anyway, the point is there were so many like weird details about the game, like Mayong Mistmore. Like he was supposed to be this mythical vampire. You know, he's what Castle Mistmore was named after, Mayong Mistmore. He was the boss. So it's like, is this guy in the game? Is he not? I remember this one Dirk. It had 12 damage, 22 delay. The name escapes me now, but there was some Dirk that dropped from Mayong Mistmore, and somehow it was documented and it was in the database on a web page, and people were like, where'd this thing come from? No, and you know, it didn't seem like anyone really had an answer, but it was out there, and people were like, well, I think it was like a one-time event at some point, and he did drop some items, but he never made it into the game until way later. I think I don't even know if he ever officially made it into the game beyond like special events, but that was a mystery for a long time, and that's just one example. There were so many quests that were never solved. I would love to see metrics from like official metrics from Varant or SOE, whoever owns it now, Daybreak Games, whoever owns EverQuest today. I just wonder, like, how many of those quests were not solved? They must have data on that. I would love to know how many were not solved. How many items were never found? I would love to know that. Another thing is, like, there were just like so many fake hallways. There were like fake walls everywhere, and there were fake floors everywhere. So you had to be really careful about. There were traps, like in Blackburrow, like a newbie zone. There was a hole where you could drop down inside of the tree, and then like that was like certain death. Like everyone just knew you don't go in that tree, don't go inside there. You're gonna drop down, and then you're gonna die. And I found that one out the hard way. And of course, I've told you the story about Befallen. I had a monk friend who went into some mystery hole and died there. Behind it, and then that puts you in like an even worse spot because it's a lock. There's a locked door in your way. Anyway, so that was something, you know, as part of the merciless game design of EverQuest. This is just one of the many things. There are even stories about how you could lock people. I think you could lock people inside of Freeport Bank. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that door could actually lock. And like only rogues could open it or something like that. And then you would have to like shout for help, like, please let me out of Freeport Bank, I'm stuck in here. And then another story is, I know you could, like, the necromancer guilds would often be hidden in the city behind like a fake wall or a rogue guild or something like that. And you would just have to know, oh, I don't go in there, or, you know, if you go in there, you're probably going to get killed by all these necromancers. But you might just be an innocent person adventuring along, and you'd be like, well, what's in this hallway? I don't know. And you would go down there and get murdered. So there was a lot of... it was always just kind of like a interesting thing about the game, is like all these nooks and crannies tucked away inside of the city. There would be like this underbelly of this dark world hidden underneath, where you had to watch out for that. What were some other ones? I know Permafrost was another one that had fake floors that would drop you down some vicious polar bears, and they would maul you. You had to be so careful about where you walked. There were a lot, and I think maybe there should have been a game mechanic that kind of indicated that it was fake, like something about the texture or something like that. I think that's a little bit too much to just randomly drop people down and you just have to know about it. In my opinion, I think they should have done that at least. But there were a lot of instances of that. And Mistmore was another one. They had a fake wall behind the courtyard that would take you up to the tower. So there was like a back door into Mistmore Castle. That was another cool one. Number 16, navigation in EverQuest was very different than any other game. There was no mini-map. There was no in-game map. So you just had to figure out where you were, where the zone lines were, and how to get to basically anything. You had two tools that in your tool belt. You had something called sense heading, and you would just have to keep hitting that. It was a skill like anything else. It would level up, and if you had a successful check, it would tell you the direction you were facing, like north, west, east, south. And then there was a second tool that was not related to skills whatsoever called, there was a /LOC command, which was /location. And that would tell you your XY coordinates inside of that zone. So eventually most people got good at binding this action called loc to a hotkey and pressing that a lot. And I actually leveled up my sense heading too. But loc was really super important. You would pretty much rely on looking at those numbers and figuring out where you were in a zone, and most people referred to important landmarks with an XY coordinate. That was pretty much how you navigated around. And in fact, I remember, like, I swear I have like loc coordinates memorized even to this day. Like, I think in Greater Fadark, I believe 2000 is a location of maybe Kelethin Ramp or Creshbone, one of the two. Anyway, the point is you had to have those kind of memorized or written down somewhere so that you could find certain things, because really it was just a big zone. You had no map and you just had to find things. Now most of the zones, to make it a little easier, most of the zones were really just a giant square or a giant rectangle, and you could hug the zone walls and kind of figure out, you know, well, if I go right and hug the wall, then I'll find the zone line to whatever, you know, to Lower Guck or whatever. Or if I hug left, then, you know, the second one will be whatever. And that worked too, but sometimes you had to find things in the middle of the zone, or sometimes you had to navigate through a maze or something like that. So sometimes you just needed to know how to use location and sense heading, and that was a lot different. That really changed the culture of the game as well, because if you don't have in-game maps, and I don't really recall even online references really being referenced heavily either. So you just got, it's kind of like how people are in real life now with GPS and everything. It's like people are lost if they don't have their GPS. It's like they don't get to use their brains as much. It's like all a part of this whole automation, you know, culture that just, let's automate everything. Just let some computer do everything for us, and then it's like, then we forget how to do things, and then we don't engage our brains as much. So that's, I think, that the more as I talk about this, I'm seeing that is part of the issue. Yes, it's convenient, but is convenient always the goal? I don't think it is. Let's move on. Number 17. The game allowed you to make mistakes. So this kind of, again, ties into point 1, which kind of make it the difficult aspect of the game. So here's an example what I'm talking about here in terms of allowed to make mistakes. You could talk to your guild master at the very beginning of the game and decide to hit A and attack him. Okay, so you could attack your guild master, and then he'd be like, bro, is you for real? And then he would like attack you right back and try to kill you. It's like, you know, my trainee here is sitting here trying to kill me. So he'll attack you right back, and like everyone in the guild will kill you and like destroy you instantly. I can't think of any other game that does this. I don't know if you can. You can. But this was a pretty common thing. Like, you could accidentally attack the banker in Kelethin. I mean, it was just like a... Think about that. You have him targeted. You hit A. You're now in a battle for your life. Like, you have to be super careful about what you hit on your keyboard. Now, I just cannot think of any other game that would be designed this way in 2018. Like, I don't think that will ever happen again, honestly. Because the industry is so careful and safe about its design decisions, and oh, this is the good practice, and we're gonna, you know, take all the sharp corners off of the world and make it very user-friendly. We're gonna maximize the appeal of our game, and we're gonna do all these user experience improvements. Yeah, I don't know, man. You lose something when you do that. You take away the joy of discovery, okay? When you explain everything to people, when you take the danger out of the game, when you take away the ability to do stupid things, it makes the world feel a little more plastic. You know, it makes it feel more like a game. And it is a game, but you don't want it to feel like you're on this, you want to feel like you have a little more agency. You want to feel like, you know, I can do things that are really bad, but I could also do things that are really good. You know, I don't want to feel like I'm on a rail cart where I'm just kind of on the ride. I'm just an observer enjoying the ride, and I'm on this controlled experience. I want to feel like, you know what, if I want to, I can jump out of this rail cart at any time and go do something crazy. I could do that. And that's something, there's something about that makes the game, the entire experience completely different. You could attack guards, you could attack vendors, you could attack anyone in the city. You can go and you could attack them, you could even kill them and they would respawn, but you could go and kill them. In the newbie city for Wood Elves, Kelethin, you could actually fall off of the ramps. Like, the whole city is a death trap, okay? Think of what bad design this is. Like, you could be in the newbie city, like you just bought this $50 game. I think it came out at 50. And you could install the game, you'd load up, and you'd be running around, and you would run a little too far and you could fall off the ramp and instantly die, and you'd be like, I don't even know where I was, and you would respawn and you'd be like, oh, I don't even have my stuff and I'm gonna have to find my stuff. You know, so that's where the famous phrase, has anyone seen my corpse? Because I don't know where it is. You would seriously be asking people, and out of character you'd be like, /OOC, has anyone seen my corpse? And sometimes people will be like, yes, I have seen your corpse, it's over here. And sometimes people are like, no, I have no idea. And it's just pretty crazy that was actually in the game, and you could actually fall off and die, and you would have no idea where your corpse was. And so, again, you gotta be careful when you play EverQuest. Bad things are gonna happen, but also good things are gonna happen. Number 18, griefing and mischief. There's a lot of griefing and mischief in EverQuest, and griefing has a very negative connotation, which it can sometimes people go a little too far, but there was very mischievous griefing in EverQuest, which was kind of part of the culture of the game, where anything goes almost, to an extent. For example, perfect example is using feign death to train other people. Okay, so monks and necromancers had a skill called feign death. They would fake their death, and the mobs chasing them would end up would de-aggro right wherever they were. And so if another group like made you angry, or you were mad at them and you wanted to get back at them, you could get a giant train of mobs, run past them, and then feign death right at the right moment, and that group would train right onto them. And then you could pop right back up and be like, I'm gonna go get some more, and then you could just keep training them over and over, which is pretty wild, and that you could do that. I don't think any other game allowed that, but again, same theme, right? Like, the fact that people could be jerks, they had the capability to be complete jerks, made people, it's like the way people can walk around in America and carry guns, like an open carry society. Like, some states you can just open carry, and you know, some people don't like that, but I bet you it makes people a lot more polite all of a sudden. You know, hopefully, if you're living in a civilized country, right? People are a lot more polite when they know that there may be consequences that they don't want to deal with. For the most part, this was pretty rare. I didn't see people training very often, but once in a while you'd get a jerk, and you would get people getting a tiff, and they would start, you know, griefing each other like that. feign death was one way that they could do that. Another, there were a lot of like subtle ways you could grief people. You could like arm other NPCs with like really fast daggers, and then they would like do way more damage. You could block hallways. For example, you could cause a train, or you could just wait for a train. If you're a big giant ogre, you could stand in a hallway, like a really narrow hallway by the zone line. Perfect example is Nagafen's lair, Solusek B. You would just stand in that lair, in that hallway with an ogre, and it was so hard to get around him because they're so big, and player characters actually had collision with each other. So you would have a hell of a time getting around him, and then you would end up dying because you had like 40 kobolds chasing you. And there was some guy, you know, an ogre in the hallway named Breakfast Pancakes that wouldn't let you by because he was huge and just like blocking you. And you'd be like messaging him all pissed, like, you blankety blank, how dare you? You blocked me. How dare you? Then you'd have like an all out, like, you know, drama. Again, EverQuest was a drama generating factory. Like, I've never seen so much drama in a game before. Another thing was charm. You could kind of do the same thing with feign death. You could charm something and then like break charm and then memblur it, and then it would just do the same thing that feign death did. You could kill steal from people to grief them. You could was there more? I'm trying to think. I think that was about it. There's a lot of little weird mischievous things you could do too. Like you could drop items on the ground, and you could like make art with the stuff you put on the ground. You could like spell things that would offend them, or make like a swastika, or with platinum, with copper coins or whatever. Yeah, you could do so many stupid things like that that would just annoy or just to be mischievous. I remember people making artwork with mod rods. You could basically drop them on the ground, and it would make like a picture or spell something. So this is another example of just like the goofy things you could do in that game to stir up mischief. Number 19, innovative game mechanics. I didn't really know how to... There were so many things in EverQuest that were like a first for me that were so different and innovative. The whole aggro concept. I don't think anything had an aggro list the way EverQuest did. And maybe I'm wrong, I can't think of another, but aggro was a pretty new, unique concept, at least to me. The way mobs had their own aggro list that prioritized. So aggro was a big part of the game. Like, you needed someone that could tank. You needed someone that could help manage aggro. You needed, casters that were careful and they had to manage their aggro, but also do DPS. That was a big part of the game. And even like doing certain actions, like I remember sitting would cause a crazy amount of aggro. Like if you tried to sit near a mob, he would like turn and like whack you, and it would hit. If you were sitting, you were hit for full damage. So it was kind of like, there were a lot of interesting gameplay mechanics that came out of managing aggro, and how that was all very new at that time. And I just remember that being a big learning curve. It was like, oh wow, I have to be careful. I can't just cast snare instantly right away. I had to be careful about that. And if something was rooted, like, then it would attack based on distance. So there were a lot of interesting mechanics that you had to learn about that were new and different in EverQuest. What was another one? I previously mentioned this, but you could arm your pets with weapons, which was really cool. Like, the only other game I can think of that did this was Diablo 2. You could get an Iron Golem, but you turned a weapon into an Iron Golem. But in this, you could actually like take weapons that you found and give it to the pet, and it would make the pet use those. It would use the delay of the weapons. So you could give it really fast weapons, and it would have like crazy fast attacks, and it had a big difference. It was a big impact. So if you could get like fine steel daggers, then it would be a big difference, and it would like, pets in that game did a lot of damage. Necro and magician pets. So that was a big deal in that game. And you could even give them to NPCs, and those NPCs would benefit from from doing that. And like I said, as I said previously, you could grief people that way by giving them like some crazy 19 delay weapon, and they would actually hit that fast, and they would like tear people up. The aggro mechanics also were related to like illusions, and you could even use sneak or hide, and that would affect your aggro as well. Like sometimes you could even complete a quest because you changed your aggro by sneaking or hiding, and then you could complete the quest because of it. So there are a lot of little things that I've never really saw in a game before. Harmony and Membler, and how distance and aggro tied together, and it was just the fact that you could wipe an aggro list. I think that was all really pretty new. I think the sword and sorcery aspect was pretty standard in many ways, but also it was also a very different kind of system. And there were just so many things about EverQuest that were innovative. It almost required its own video, and I'm probably not even thinking of half of them. But yeah, I just know that there were a lot of things in EverQuest that were very different compared to games prior to that. So I feel like I had to learn a lot, because it wasn't like other games up until that point very much. I think it actually came from, a little side note, I think it came from Deku Mud. Have you heard of that? It was a mud, which were quite big in those days. I heard a lot. There were rumors about, whatever X% of the game design in EverQuest came from Deku Mud, and there was a conspiracy theory about it. And then apparently it was heavily influenced by that. And I don't know, I never played that, but so maybe it did steal some ideas from that. But guess what, there's pretty much everyone steals from everyone. Little newsflash. Let's move to our last one, which is number 20, the zone lore and the character design. There was so much attention to detail. When you look at the world of EverQuest, it is so obvious that this was a labor of love. This was a true labor of love. Like, there was so much attention to detail. It feels like someone must have spent years just handcrafting this entire universe, and then it became a game. Like, it was like someone's, because there were so many little details in the game. It's like I couldn't. And that kind of ties into like the Michael's Shenanigans video, like how many mysteries there were in the game, how many random details there were that no one really understood. For example, there's a whole video that Michael's Shenanigans did just about the paintings in EverQuest. Like, there's so much unique artwork in the game. Like, all of the little paintings that are all over, just in Castle Mistmore alone, you could find so many paintings and just be like, whoa, what's going on in Castle Mistmore? What's this painting? What's that painting? What is this a picture of? And it was actually like pretty interesting. And there were just so many landmarks in EverQuest that were super memorable, like even to this day, and like iconic. For example, the chessboard. Okay, I know Michael Shenanigans did a video just on the chessboard. There's all these theories about the chessboard. A chessboard was like in Butcher Block Mountains. It was very memorable as like a chessboard with like chess pieces, and they had mobs that were chess themed in that area as well. The Aviac Treehouse is another landmark that is definitely memorable in South Karana. The diving board in Lake Wrath is another one that people bring up. The Minotaur Hero in Steamfont Mountains, people remember that. Of course, the Befallen, the Well of Doom in that one zone that my monk friend learned about. Another one is Pizjin and Varsoon in Kinos Hills. Like, you can get this glowing black stone, I think it's called, that is like super rare, and like people were trying to figure out like the spawn timer for Haddon, and there was so much speculation about its spawn timer, how it worked. And that's just another one of those things that people just absolutely remember. And then Holly Windstalker and Cross Treewind and Kenos Hills, like, it's just part of that zone that you just is so memorable. And some more are the clickable orbs in Akanon. This is one a friend brought up to me, but I didn't really know what he was talking about. Maybe some of the viewers will. But Akanon's not a city that I really fully explored, but there was a lot of neat stuff there as well. The Tree City of Kelethin, that's another landmark that was definitely a memorable, interesting thing. Kithakor Forest at night after it became like a death trap. It was at first it was a peaceful forest, but then it became like this higher level death trap. And it was kind of a cool change, but it definitely made it a memorable landmark in terms of how dangerous it was, because it was right by a newbie zone, and so it became a really dangerous place to go. Lower Guck is another land. It was a dungeon, but it's just probably the most infamous zone in all of EverQuest. Like, I think I could navigate Lower Guck to this day by heart. Like, I know and it's so twisted up and hard to navigate, yet I could probably go in there and walk all the way to the Undead Frog King, like, to this day. The bridge goes from north to west Karana. It was like a huge bridge. Like, everything seemed so big. I don't know what it was. It was like the first person camera angle looking up more or something like that. Maybe that's what it was. But yeah, it was definitely, I remember that bridge. I remember that cliff going up to, I think it's North Karana, up to Bypass Hold. You go up that cliff side. Like, there was nothing like that in World of Warcraft. It felt so, I don't know what it was, but it just felt so big and dangerous and austere. And the Estate of Unrest, the basement down there, was so spooky. They did a great job on that. It felt so dangerous, and it was definitely memorable as well. Another one my friend brings up is the Gorge. I didn't really remember this one as much but we were kind of talking about memorable places, and he talked about the creepy Evil Eyes and Beholder's Gorge. I didn't really think about those as much, but I didn't go there that much, but he thought it was something that was really memorable. And yeah, like, Kenos had all kinds of weird stuff inside of that city that I remember. Like, there was like a weird spaceship temple in a Vrodset knife in Kenos. I remember that thing. That was weird. Like, what was that all about? I don't know. This is part of the mystery of that game. Another famous mob is Fippy Darkpaw. Like, and Queen Clacknack, or whatever the heck, Clicknick or Clacknick or whatever it was. There was like that weird beetle. Like, everyone remembers them. If they started in Kenos or Surefall Glade, like, they know who those mobs are. Fippy Darkpaw yelling all the time. It's just part of the lore of the game. Was just so memorable. Ambassador Divin and Emperor Crush. Super memorable mobs. They were in Crushbone, and they were like the boss mobs of that zone. It's just like, where are the equivalents in World of Warcraft? Like, I can only think of maybe a handful of mobs, and like, I played that game for just as long, really. I would say like 04 to maybe 06, and then I played again when Lich King came out, like in 09, 2010. So I probably played almost as much as I did play EverQuest. So it's like, you know, why don't I remember nearly as much? I don't think it's because I'm getting old. I just think the experience in EverQuest was much richer and more poignant and more deep. I don't know what it was, man. I can't even explain it fully myself sometimes. I think maybe it's because of the difficulty. Maybe? Or was it something else? I'm not even sure, man. It's hard to say, but all I know for sure is I don't think I'll ever play another game like EverQuest. So I'm interested to hear what you thought about EverQuest and how that compared to, say, World of Warcraft or other MMORPGs. Leave some comments. Let me know what you think. Do you think I covered the highlights. Did I miss anything? This was a hard video to make, I have to be honest, because there's so many details that I've forgotten about EverQuest, yet I still remember so much, and I feel like there's so much that I didn't cover, yet this video is really, really long, and I feel like I've barely scratched the surface. So I'm interested to hear your feedback. Let me know what you thought, and maybe I'll make another follow-up video if I feel like it's appropriate. And I'll see you guys next time, guys.